This is Houston Matters. I'm Craig Cohen. Recently, the Justice Department announced the city of Beaumont agreed to pay $475,000 and change its zoning and land use practices to resolve a lawsuit alleging it discriminated against people with disabilities who sought to live in small group homes in the city's residential neighborhoods. The lawsuit alleged the city violated the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act when it imposed a 1/2-mile spacing rule between community homes for people with intellectual or developmental disabilities. Justice also argued the city was wrong to impose fire code requirements calling for residential sprinkler systems in those group homes, a rule exceeding what was called for by the state. The city argued it was, in fact, following state guidelines. The state disagreed. Those rules forced the closure of some group homes, prompting complaints, which led to the lawsuit. In a few minutes, we'll hear from Lex Frieden, one of the architects of the ADA. But first, South Texas College of Law professor Matthew Festa joins us. Hi, Matthew.
Hello, Craig.
What does the Fair Housing Act call for?
The Fair Housing Act prevents discrimination on the basis of race, national origin, religion, sex, a couple other things, and disability was added to it in 1988.
And then how might the Americans with Disabilities Act apply in this case?
The Americans with Disabilities Act generally doesn't apply to private housing as much as the FHA does, but it also covers a broader realm and kind of a statement of policy of for instance, public areas in private housing units need to have certain accommodations, and public housing as well falls under the ADA.
Is it common for the federal government to intercede like this?
It's not entirely common, but when it does happen, it tends to go big. It's quite a thing for the federal government to interfere in a highly localized land use decision. But there is, when these things do happen, it comes to the attention of the Attorney General of the United States, and they put a big team on it.
And then the way they pursue it is typically through a lawsuit like this?
Well, they try to do negotiations first. They try to resolve it with alternative dispute resolutions. But it's hard when you're dealing with a local government. You're dealing with laws that they have passed under a presumably valid process. So sometimes it does come to litigation.
Does there need to be evidence of intentional discrimination for a city like Beaumont to run afoul of the Fair Housing Act or the ADA?
The Supreme Court has interpreted the Fair Housing Act and the ADA to require only a showing of disparate impact, meaning that if the laws themselves, if the policies have the result of interfering with the opportunity for housing for the disabled, they can just by that reason alone violate the terms of the law.
What do you see as the implications of a case like this as we seek to provide fair housing on the one hand, but on the other hand, also defer to local governments to establish land use?
It does potentially put local governments in something of a dilemma because local land use laws and zoning codes are generally designed to to stabilize neighborhoods, to preserve the character of communities. And this is a federal law that says there are some other priorities that have to be accommodated within those decisions.
Matthew Festa is a professor of law at South Texas College of Law and a research scholar at Rice University. Matthew, thanks very much.
Always a pleasure, Craig.
And joining us now is Lex Frieden, director of the Independent Living Research Utilization Program at TIRR Memorial Hermann and one of the architects of the ADA. Lex, welcome back to Houston Matters.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today.
The city of Beaumont imposed a 1/2-mile spacing rule prohibiting small group homes from operating there. Do you know how they went about doing that?
Well, I mean, they went about it the same way they do any kind of ordinance setting in their community, I think. I don't think there was anything unusual about the process that they used to do it. I think the purpose for which they did it is what's in question.
And what is your impression of what that purpose was?
Well, I think that while they may not have said that in the proceedings, their intent was to prevent group homes from being located in residential areas in their city.
Do you feel the same way when it came to the fire code requirements that I guess in essence prohibited folks with intellectual or developmental disabilities from living there?
Clearly the same motivation caused both of those changes.
Now, the city had alleged they were just trying to be in line with state law. The state said neither requirement was actually required by Texas law. So do you ultimately feel this was something that these were intentional steps to keep people with disabilities out of Beaumont? Is it that direct?
Well, I like to not make judgments like that. I prefer to think it was an intentional step by people in Beaumont to protect the value of their property and to ensure the safety of their families and their children. And I hate to believe that it was motivated strictly by a desire not to have certain people living with them in the neighborhood.
Do you find, generally speaking, there are some communities in Texas that are just more or less openly accommodating to people with disabilities?
It's hard to generalize. There are some communities in Texas where there seems to be at the level of public interest, the level of public debate, the level of public authority, I guess, more of an open mind about integration of people with disabilities, and for that matter, people with other differences from those that may live in one neighborhood and the next. Clearly, we have communities in Texas that are more integrated than others, and I think part of that is motivated by the leadership in those communities, the intellectual leadership, the political leadership, and otherwise. I don't for a moment believe that everyone in every community agrees with that, and I don't for a moment believe that everyone in every community is a bigot.
Do you think that sometimes there's an impression, perhaps mistaken, that being more accommodating has some economic impact either to homeowners or to city governments or other municipalities, that there may be some indirect assumptions that are made that, oh, well, if we try and be too accommodating, this will have some sort of negative economic consequence?
That's an interesting and somewhat complex theory, although you described it as a kind of incidental or sub-level judgment. I do think it is possible that those kinds of feelings, those kinds of judgments affect the way we make policies. And I think in the case of Beaumont, the Justice Department may have felt that way too when they made their finding.
If indeed the intent was that people with disabilities not be able to live in some areas within Beaumont, what do you think might motivate that attitude?
I think there may have been a lack of understanding. There actually may be a lack of understanding of people with disabilities in the population, in the general population. I think sometimes what we don't know, what we haven't experienced, we're not comfortable with. And I think those communities where people with disabilities are more integrated are more likely to have an open mind about that. And they may be just neighborhoods and communities where people aren't living with disability, where their family members don't have a disability. They may not appreciate the fact that those of us with disabilities are just like anybody else. We have the same dreams, we have the same motives, we have the same desire to be a part of the community. In respect to the issue of housing that the Justice Department spoke about, we find in communities across America this discrimination that occurs on the basis of disability as it relates to these group homes. And I think people think about group homes in the wrong way. I think in the community in Beaumont, where they affected this change in policy, they were thinking that these group homes would be institutions of some sort. And that's pretty clear when you think about them imposing the fire extinguisher rule on that the way you would an institution. But in fact, these are more like homes in many neighborhoods where extended families live together. And the people who live in these group homes very much, most often regard one another as a family member. And the caregivers who stay with them or who visit them see themselves most often as family members. So I think part of the issue in Beaumont and in other communities where we find this issue manifested is a lack of understanding and a lack of acceptance and maybe a lack of empathy.
You know, it's interesting you mention all of that in the context of the news that we've heard in recent days about accommodation for transgender folks in restrooms. And that's become such a debate this week. Of course, it's not a new debate here in Greater Houston. We found that was a big part of the dialogue here over the course of the last year. Do you think some of what you just said about the idea that we have a hard time accepting things we don't understand or don't experience is at play in that discussion as well?
Well, that's the very nature of discrimination in a way. People not appreciating, not understanding, not living the life of another person, and therefore not being willing to accept it, not being comfortable with it. Interesting thing about the transgender bathroom issue is that those of us who use wheelchairs and have mobility impairments have been using transgender facilities for decades, because that has been the solution years before the ADA. If somebody in a wheelchair at the University of Houston, downtown Houston, at a business or whatever, worked there or used that space, the environmental engineers, the building maintenance people, the people responsible for the facility would add a bathroom that had a wider door and more space to accommodate the wheelchair. And they did not add two, one for males in wheelchairs and another one for females. They added one, and then that bathroom became a family bathroom. What about parents of an opposite gender of their child who needs to change their diapers? So this discussion about transgender bathrooms, to me, is a very odd kind of departure from the reality that we know. And that reality is people can share a bathroom and they can do it safely. And in some respects, it's a more efficient solution than the kind of segregated approach many people see as the appropriate answer now.
You were recently named to the Metro Board. How significant is it to you that not only is someone with a disability on that board, but specifically that it's you? You led efforts to improve accommodations on Houston City buses for years. Ending up on the Metro Board, that's got to be kind of encouraging.
Well, it was ironic in a way, the sense that I was involved with a group of people who in 1978 went downtown, wanted to ride the bus with the mayor. At the time, Mayor Hoffine said, any citizen can ride the bus today, no charge. We want to use our transit system. And those of us in wheelchairs showed up and were obviously not able to get on the bus, and began a long dialogue with the city at that point in time. As recently as 1988, the group that had been working on that, myself, my wife, and others, wound up suing Metro to make the vehicles accessible to people with disabilities because, in fact, over 10 years, they had failed to live up with what we thought were good faith commitments. And now, decades later, I'm on that board and responsible for ensuring that people have fair and equal treatment in use of that public entity.
Is that kind of, from your perspective, what you think is most important for you to accomplish in that role, to sort of be that voice that reminds everybody that we need to accommodate everyone?
I think people expect me to do that. It's not my main objective. I have an obligation to the Transit Authority, to the public, to the mayor that appointed me, and the city council that confirmed my appointment, not to be strictly, I think, focused on a subset of the issues that Metro deals with, but to be concerned about the whole program, the whole company, and the whole region. And therefore, I am, while I have exceptional knowledge about the area of transit for people with impairments, physical disabilities, and others, I also have an interest and a commitment to represent the larger public in my role.
Lex Frieden, thanks very much for talking with me.
Been my pleasure.